on Iron Man comics and a conversation on the military-industrial complex and the combination of issues that those two topics bring together. My name is Mikkel. I'm here with Olivia, Josue, Spencer, and Miriam. We're going to get into intros a little bit more later. Um, but we wanted to start off this time together by sharing a little bit more about what the military-industrial complex is, just so that we're starting with a good foundation and baseline and a shared understanding of what we all come um, to this conversation around. And then we're gonna kick it over to our panelists who are gonna present a little bit more about the topic and the issue and how they relate to it. Um, so before we get going, I'm gonna start with a presentation, which I hope I can properly present here. Can everyone see my screen okay? Um, Hopefully you can see it there. So the military industrial complex at a snapshot is a really complicated system, but to kind of break it down really easily, this is what we mostly see. It's our tax dollars going into Congress, corporations lobbying with their money into Congress, our tax dollars going into the military, and kind of going into this cycle of producing endless wars, contracting with these corporations, and then weapons and mercenaries going into the war system as well. Um, and for those that don't know, like the origin of the military industrial complex, it starts as a term that was used to warn the public about the looming threat of the issue by the then departing President Dwight Eisenhower. And really, it's probably the simplest term that we have for a very complex and interconnected system of corruption, endless wars, fraud, wasteful spending, and profit-driven imperialism that the US is at the center of. And the kind of backdrop of this opportunity for cultural influence by the military-industrial complex um, kind of is shaped by this one example that I have, which is for folks that don't know, Sabra was introduced in the Marvel comics decades ago. And the issue came up as the relationship to the Israeli occupation and the like kind of uh, the destruction and the heartlessness that comes with the occupation. And it was a really impressive, introspective conversation when it was first introduced into the comics. And when you compare that today to where Marvel Comics is completely intertwined with some of the representation of the military industrial complex through funding, through partnerships, through recruitment kind of drives that they operate with. We see how this rewriting of these characters and some of these more complex and nuanced conversations can actually simplify and dull what the cultural narrative and experience can be. And so this is just one example of how we see culture and the military industrial complex show up. But we're hoping that through this conversation today, you'll hear more examples and hopefully learn a little bit more about how that shows up in not just people's attempts to write different narratives and produce different cultural topics, but also in the organizing and the activism that goes along with it. So with that, we're going to get started with the panel presentations. Um, and I have the exciting opportunity to present first Spencer Ackerman. So Spencer is a Pulitzer Prize and National Magazine award-winning reporter, is the author of Reign of Terror: How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump, which won a 2022 American Book Award. And he currently writes the Iron Man series for Marvel Comics. Spencer, we're gonna kick it over to you for about 10 minutes and a little bit for your presentation. So take it away.
Thank you, Mikhail. Am I unmuted now? I should be, right? Okay. Well, thanks very much for this exciting opportunity to talk about my comic book. So I'm, as Mikhail mentioned, the writer of the current series Iron Man for Marvel Comics. And to dive into it, I wanted from the start to infuse this series with a lot of the topics that I cover as a journalist, which are really, central to do with the relationship between war and capitalism, the technological developments that go into this, and the varieties of emanations on human beings from it. Iron Man's really the perfect character to do that through the movies. He's become one of the most familiar characters in pop culture worldwide. A version of the character's origin story that the movies made famous had him, as he has in his comic book version, renounce making weaponry for the US military, which had been central to his fortune. And that was kind of wrapped up in the first movie as a redemption arc for the character, a way of showing that he needed cleaner hands to operate as a hero. However, um, right in that first Iron Man movie, you also have on display the interrelationship between the movies and the US military. Very famously, a whole lot of that movie is an advertisement for the US Air Force. Iron Man, it's a weird advertisement for the Air Force because Iron Man fights and wins a dogfight with an F-22 Raptor. And at the time the movie came out, the Air Force was trying to get Congress not to kill the F-22 Raptor. So this was an exceptionally well-timed and very deliberate element of propaganda that's introduced into the character from its cinematic inception. So again, through his character history, Iron Man is simultaneously sort of seeing the error of his ways, but not fully severing ties with the military industrial complex. One of my favorite examples of this, I'm going to be doing this because I don't do screen sharing. This is a classic Iron Man run from 1998. A guy named Kurt Busiek, who's one of the greatest ever comic book writers, wrote it. And I'll put it up to the camera, but basically we see a certain General Dixon tell Tony that, hey, that new logistics software you supplied us really did the trick. So while Iron Man may not be making weapons for the US military, that's not the same thing as ceasing to contract with the US military. And additionally, throughout his character history, Iron Man has been Secretary of Defense. He's been Director of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is essentially the Marvel Universe's, it's fudgy, but America-centric global intelligence agency. And at the same time, this is a character that remains very conflicted about all of that role within the military industrial complex. One classic way that writers throughout the character history have gotten to explore this tension while retaining Iron Man's presentation as a heroic character is to pit Iron Man pit Tony Stark against the kind of scheming board of Stark Industries, which is renamed throughout the character history several times, but basically that the board wants to keep Stark as a military contractor, doesn't understand and doesn't respect and seeks to undo this turn away from that. And in this case, this is Invincible Iron Man 45. This is from 1971. And the writer Gary Friedrich showed a protest at Stark Industries' Long Island factory, calling it a death factory. And in this story, 4 protesters are killed by a different armored guardsman of the company, and Iron Man's role is to keep the peace. So this is a character really firmly tied into both the operations of the military-industrial complex and a certain critique of it. And I wanted to dive into all of that when I got the chance to write the character. Now, I want to say something really important that I believe, speaking not really as a journalist, but as a comic book writer, as a fiction writer, which is that good comic books are not polemics. I don't think that a good comic book and a good comic book story, one that I would want to read and certainly one that I would want to write, substitutes a critique of war and its economic foundations for a story that kind of shows more allegorically how these things operate. So I didn't, if anyone's going to be, looking to Iron Man to turn to the camera and say the military industrial complex is wrong and bad and we shouldn't do that, that would be a pretty awful story, and I would be embarrassed to write that, and so you're not going to see that here. But what you are going to see are superhero stories that are steeped very deeply in the critique of these things. So very early on, and this is directly influenced by work of Miriam's. In the very first issue, we see Iron Man deal with labor relations at his company, and we see that one of the things that labor worries about with Iron Man is his antipathy to selling weapons. When I come to the character, he's just gotten his company back. It's been taken over by a genocidal racist who starts basically participating in a genocide against mutant characters. If people are familiar with the X-Men, but we don't need to go into that. The point is that he is making weapons again against his will. His company is. By the time he gets the company back, I start off a story called The Stark-Roxxon War. Roxxon, I guess the easiest way to say this to non-comic book readers is like imagine Exxon in the Marvel Universe. And we start out with Iron Man trying to get his board to end its renewed tenure as a weapons manufacturer, and the board deciding that it doesn't want to do that. Instead, it wants to go along with a hostile takeover by essentially the biggest hydrocarbon company in the Marvel Universe and a supervillain think tank. So what does Iron Man do in issue 2? He decides to go after the way in which the deal is capitalized and blows up a Roxxon oil pipeline and turns that oil pipeline, the shards of it at least, into a giant anime sword. So we're not, this is a comic book. It's an action story. We're not turning swords into plowshares. We're turning oil pipelines into swords and then using them against people. So also there's an element of a kind of demonic East India company that is trying to stake out a market on Earth for its soul poison. And that's something that can kind of supercharge the board members into not just being fantastically wealthy, but ascending to a higher plane of existence. Again, it's a comic book. So, we gotta go with kind of comic book style stories. And at the end of this, when Stark wins, he doesn't win through superheroism. He wins through boardroom techniques and being essentially an arch businessman who implores these nether beings who are seeking scale on Earth to play the futures markets and look at how, when you look at it, Iron Man's record is pretty unblemished. He always beats villains like this supervillain think tank and this oil company, and so why bet against him? And the nether beings are like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. So forget that deal. However, when he wins, he's told at the end that it's a lot harder to get out of the weapons business than he might think. This is his adversary, a woman named Justine Hammer. She is a supervillain called the Ironmonger. She takes that title in our series, and at the end, she gives Tony her kind of Ironmonger amulet and says, "You're the Ironmonger now because you are still a weapons contractor." So then to go back to the earlier kind of critique that it's not just weapons, the second arc of the story is called The Machinery of Order. And what that does is look at how Stark's company is kind of not just a military contractor, but it's also like the premier technology company on Earth. It is basically, in my telling of it, it also, because of stuff that previous writers have done, scales up green energy. So it's sort of kind of when you look at it, it's kind of like an economic critique of what this thing is. It's basically something on the level of a Taiwan semiconductor, one of the most important economic engines in the world, something that essentially keeps Stark, even if he never wears the armor, as a billionaire behind this kind of company, one of the most powerful people on Earth. So this looks at how the surveillance applications of what Tony Stark makes are themselves weapons that threaten freedom. We start, we see them use to lock up black and brown Chicagoans in a warehouse while supervillains who are using Stark technology attempt to destroy and purchase property in these decimated Chicago neighborhoods to replace the now imprisoned population. And it's also a case of blowback, where the supervillain who's doing this is a foreigner who S.H.I.E.L.D. has deposed and then uses the tools of S.H.I.E.L.D. made by people like Stark against Americans. And I'm just going to kind of read a certain speech that she gives to kind of illustrate what, in fact, all of this is doing. And she's also kind of like a Terminator-like character. She's a cyborg. Again, it's a comic book. But she says, when it comes to, I didn't, Stark, protests that, like, you didn't make weapons for these guys then. And she goes, you made tools. Your satellite arrays, your data mining and geolocation software, your micropixel cameras, and your AI suites. When it comes to the machinery of order, the best weapons don't shoot. They capture, they store, they accumulate. They target the foundations of freedom. And so that's sort of where she's coming from with that. And at the end of it, it gets Stark to kind of think about how surveillance capitalism that he engages in undermines his determination to no longer be a weapons merchant. And why did I do that? Because, we see right now there's a shift taking place in the military-industrial complex away from the big five legacy weapons manufacturers and toward something that looks more like startup, venture capital, private equity, surveillance, and AI corporations. We can see that with Palantir, with Anduril, with the kinds of things that Mark Andreessen invests in, with Elon Musk. This is a crucial transition happening now economically in this direction. This is very much the fruit of the war on terror. These are investments in surveillance tools that the CIA financed in the case of Palantir, and are now reaching a kind of maturation that looks to transform not just the military-industrial complex in its image, but export a desire for war against China and entrench that into the firmament of American public discourse. And we are seeing that not just with Trump now, but with Biden previously, and then building on what Trump won established. So if you're interested in that, this two-issue arc is in Iron Man 4 and 5, and it's called Machinery of Order. But now we're basically getting into something that introduces a twist. This is Iron Man number 6. It came out on Wednesday, and it introduces a story called, as you can see on the cover, The Insurgent Iron Man. I'll stop talking really soon, but in the rest of the Marvel universe, at this point in time, Doctor Doom has declared himself global emperor, and his argument for, well, not really an argument, it's an assertion of power, but his propaganda is that the rest of the world has descended into chaos and economic deprivation, and essentially the current system as it is will only produce more of that, and now we need a strong man to come and make these things right. And who would be more trustworthy to do that than Doctor Doom, right? So Iron Man decides that he is going to, for all his reluctance as a weapons manufacturer, particularly in all of the previous issues that I've written, now he's going to kind of look at that and wonder if the threat that Doctor Doom poses to the world order is such that he needs to remain a weapons manufacturer and kind of embrace that aspect of his identity. Very early on, he makes contact with a terrorist militia from the part of the fictional world that Doctor Doom is from, and he is looking to sponsor them. And this is like an explicitly racist group. My inspirations for it were basically the Azov Battalion in Ukraine and what used to be called the Nusra Front in Syria, that while I was writing this story, conquered Damascus. So that was a pretty wild thing to see as I was attempting to fictionalize it. But basically, what the lead terrorist tells Tony Stark is that he wants missiles for Stark to manufacture, sell them to Doctor Doom, as weird as that sounds, because this terrorist militia is basically made up of purged officers from the army of the fictional country that Doctor Doom controls. And so this terrorist group's allies will control the depots where the missiles go, and they'll use that to start an uprising against Doctor Doom. Tony's logic is, if Doom can't even control Latveria, he certainly can't control the world, and he won't be, able to have this kind of viable narrative as a liberator if he's fighting against, his own people as he suppresses them. So at the very end of this issue, spoilers for anyone who hasn't read it, Iron Man says to his board, which he has previously fought to get out of the weapons business, we have a responsibility on behalf of global stability to accept our new reality and our place in it, to keep our Emperor's peace. Stark Unlimited will become the sole weapons provider to Victor Von Doom. And we're supposed to have the reaction that this board member is having right here. Is, oh my God, how could this happen? How could he convince himself of this? How can this threat justify this decision? And, we'll be looking at this throughout this next 5-issue arc. It's going to be a very, very intense story that asks a lot of uncomfortable questions about permissibility in warfare and permissibility in capitalism, with the aim of illuminating how intimately connected they are, have been, and will continue to be, thanks to the systems and institutions that Iron Man and Tony Stark embody. Thanks very much.
Wow. Thanks so much, Spencer. That is such an incredible grounding in this conversation. And I hope that all of you, especially the nerdy ones amongst us, are like enthralled by that deep dive and makes you want to go out there and grab those comics, which are a whole new perspective. I'm going to pass it to Olivia, who's going to introduce Miriam, who's our next panelist.
Hey everyone, Olivia. I'm based here in DC and do a lot around anti-militarism and its intersections with everything. I'm learning a lot today and am here to introduce Miriam Pemberton, who's, as many of you might know, the author of 6 stops on the National Security Tour, Rethinking Warfare, Economies, and the Research Fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's also the co-editor with William Hartung, who I think was on here at one point, and maybe still is, of Lessons from Iraq, Avoiding the Next War. So hand it over to you, Miriam. And Miriam's video is not working, so we might be hearing from Miriam, but not seeing.
Miriam, if you're speaking, you're still on mute.
How's that?
Good.
There we go. Sorry. I do apologize. I can't get my camera to work, and for a moment I couldn't get the audio to work. But on the other hand, I kind of have a face for radio, so maybe this isn't so bad. I don't know. So Mikhail has laid out basically what the military-industrial complex is. It got started after World War II, when the U.S. Military-industrial base had been revamped for this temporary war emergency of World War II. And GM started making tanks, and then after the war, they started making cars again. But at that point, the Cold War was beginning, and so it was decided that this temporary war emergency needed to become permanent, and the military-industrial base needed to be maintaining itself in perpetuity. So I'll say that the original draft of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech, called it the military-industrial congressional complex, which I would say is a more accurate and complete descriptor, referring to Congress's role in preserving and expanding the military economy. In that book that Olivia mentioned, I described the various ways that the military-industrial complex has used to work its will over the rest of us, like paying swarms of lobbyists. The biggest contractor in the world, one company, Lockheed Martin, employs more people to lobby on the Hill than there are members of Congress. So they outnumber the members that they're lobbying for these weapon systems. The military-industrial complex also spends all sorts of time hyping and inflating the threats that we supposedly face to justify these budget increases. But I think the most important tool they have is the ways they buy influence with members of Congress. Two main tools for this. One is obviously campaign contributions. I mean, if you look at where these companies are feeding their campaign contributions, I mean, the corruption is so obvious. It's just amazing. They are focusing that money on the heads of the committees that are mostly responsible for deciding what we spend on the military. It's kind of astounding. But the other tool they use is to spread their contracts as widely as possible across the American landscape. So the F-35, the most expensive weapon system ever conceived, they brag that it is made in 45 states. And this is obviously not the way to run an efficient industrial enterprise, but it's a very good way of creating a political protection racket for these companies and for the money that sustains them. So why this is a problem? Basically, it comes down to the distortive effect it has on what our country is about. We have ideas like we're spreading democracy around the world, or maybe until recently we had those ideas. But in fact, the majority of the budget that Congress votes on every year goes to assembling the firepower to seed the world with the means of violence and destruction and death. U.S. also uses this firepower to kind of appoint ourselves as the guy calling the shots for the rest of the world because we've got the biggest guns. Also robs ourselves of the means to make our lives better, make our citizens' lives better, and those of the citizens of the rest of the world. We do this in the name of national security, but spending more on our military than the next 9 countries, most of them are allies, put together, and then saying we need to cut services, we need to cut healthcare and education and clean energy infrastructure funding because we can't afford them. This seems like madness to me. So what to do about this? Well, beginning with policy work, there are people who spend a lot of time defeating, and some of them I see on this call, spend a lot of time defeating the makers of the military budget who are really good at hiding what they're doing. But these people, defeat them all and give us the facts about what's happening with the budget process, what the budget actually entails, and exposing the imbalances in it. Some people spend time putting together really strong lists of what we can cut with no sacrifice to our security, which weapon systems, and providing rationales for why we can do this without making ourselves any less safe. Some people focus particularly on trade-offs. So how much better off we could be if we could make those kinds of cuts, and what we're giving up by not making them. I'd say the trade-off that looms over all the rest of them is that we are heading for climate catastrophe, one that no military forces on Earth can possibly hold back. And yet we persist in giving the money that we need to address this crisis to the Pentagon instead. I would say even Biden's green industrial policy, which was the best we've ever had, was not even anywhere near, you put it all together, not anywhere near 10% of what the Pentagon is getting. Just in terms of trade-offs, I'll just mention one organization, the National Priorities Project, that really focuses on these trade-offs and provides activists to target their local area and find out how much that local area gives to the Pentagon, and what else their tax dollars in that particular district or state or locality could do with the money instead. How many jobs could be created in healthcare or education or so on. Then, of course, we've got to fight back against the military-industrial complex with organizing. And Josue will be talking about that. I'll just say, I think the best organizing efforts are the ones that link work on militarism with other movements. The Poor People's Campaign, I'll just mention, which is explicitly picking up where Martin Luther King left off, connecting militarism, poverty, and racism. And then the Poor People's Campaign also adds in the climate movement into that roster. But it's crucial to find ways to craft anti-militarist, anti-military industrial complex messages to people who've never given them a second thought, by inventing new and creative means of engaging with popular culture. And I would say nobody's doing this like Spencer is doing it. It was absolutely mind-boggling and exciting to find out that in some way my work has helped him do his work, which is kind of incredible. He gets the prize for breaking new creative ground on how to do this. And I hope that there are folks out there who are watching or listening, who are feeling ideas of their own percolating in their brains and are ready to get creative, as Spencer has done, and put Spencer-like energy to them. So I will turn it over to Josue now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam, and I'll pass it over to him shortly. But I think just right now here in DC, when all of these departments are being shut down and from one to the other, and Doge's whole point is to cut spending, or like make spending more efficient, and no better place to start than with the military, with the Pentagon budget, and just having that conversation with people across movements of like this invest, divest that you're talking about, National Priorities Project, but then also as more people are getting activated now, drawing those connections is this is the perfect time to do it. So thanks for highlighting that on the end. And I will pass it back to Miguel to introduce.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you, Olivia, for that reflection. Josue Sican is a field organizer for Dissenters, a youth anti-militarism and anti-imperial organization. His work has included campaigning against Boeing and its contract with the city of Chicago, as well as accompanying Maya Ixil, hopefully I didn't butcher that, Maya Ixil victims in their case to hold a Guatemalan military officer accountable for his role in the Guatemalan genocide. Josue, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Mikkel. Nice to meet everybody. Before I get into dissenters in particular, I think I want to touch on some things that were mentioned before. I think one thing that really stood out to me is the idea of manufactured consent. And I think Marvel actually serves as a great example of manufactured consent, which is necessary for the military industrial complex to flourish. So oftentimes the media reinforces US foreign policy and its increased militarization. One like prime example um, or means by which they do this is by identifying some unquantifiable evil, and that someone out there, typically the US, needs to do something about it, right? It was alluded to earlier about kind of a supposed impending war with China. I think the war on terror, really driven by Islamophobic rhetoric, can oftentimes be matched to how enemies of the state are portrayed in popular media. You know, I think the prime example that comes to me when it comes to Marvel and Marvel studios in particular, so like movies, is we look at Black Panther and how Killmonger had, you know, made some points around colonization, but of course his means to his end was genocide, and therefore somebody had to stop him, right? And I think whether it's like something like CSI or Criminal Minds or the thousands of other TV shows and movies out there that center like a US agent of some sort, it's posited as like, well, someone needs to like push back against this evil, and it has to be the US. And that it kind of drives this need for hyper-militarization, oftentimes coupled with being okay with collateral damage if it's to maintain the peace, but any form of violence that looks to um, topple like the powers that be are not seen as okay and are seen as contrary to peace. And so it's always posited as like um, the alternatives to U.S. hegemony are worse. And what this has created in the U.S. is that our youth is dependent on the war economy. Whether joining the military is the only feasible way to envision a long-term career, or as the only means to pay for college. And then once you go through college, in particular, if you're in the STEM field, then your only option for a stable job is to work at a Lockheed, to work at a Raytheon, to work at a Boeing. And the reason I set this precedent or like want to set this context, is despite these two huge forces that impact our youth all the time, they still choose to be like, you know what? I don't believe it. You know what? I want to do something about it. You know what? Like, how can I combat militarism and imperialism? And those are the people that are joining us at Dissenters to want to take a stand, right? We are a youth anti-militarist and anti-imperialist organization um, with members across the country who are organizing on and off campuses to try and combat the military industrial complex in whatever way speaks to them locally. So on campuses, that's looked like campaigns against the militarization of police, the arming of police, pushing for the eventual disbandment of police departments on a college campus. It looks like interfering with uh, weapons manufacturer recruitment at college campuses, or pushing to end partnerships with departments. It looks like waging divestment campaigns. Divestment campaigns have, you know, really flourished over the past 14 to 16 months, you know, unfortunately, as a response to the ongoing genocide in Palestine, you know, both in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Um, and they choose to fight. And they choose to fight despite the fact that we're constantly spoon-fed this idea that the answer is US intervention, that the answer is US power, whether soft or hard power on a foreign policy standpoint. And so it was really interesting to hear from Spencer, you know, some of these arcs that he outlined, because we often talk about the board as well when we talk about like both the board of trustees at a university and how they often overlap with the boards at these private corporations, and they also overlap with government positions. I think it was sharp of Miriam to like outline like it's not just a military industrial complex, but Congress plays a key part in it. right? One thing I learned recently is that at least 37 US lawmakers traded 100 and up to 113 million in arms stock in 2024, right? Eight of those people actually held positions on the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committee. And I think to me, that's an answer to why, despite the defense sector being so powerful, they actually don't make that many contributions financially to elections. And I think it's because politicians stand to gain money, not just influence, not just holding their position in power, but like they line their pockets with blood money. And I think that really highlights like why it's so important for us to highlight the board. And then Spencer then spoke about this second arc, which takes place in Chicago, that kind of looks into surveillance and the local militarization of police departments, and speaking to Black and brown people in Chicago being criminalized, being jailed, and at the same time, the real culprits of harm in our communities are able to do their bidding around a business table. And it brings me to something that actually I'm based in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, and not too far down the road, there's currently an effort by the Department of Defense to build a quantum campus, where one of the goals is to build the first functioning quantum computer. And it is, first and foremost, a Department of Defense project, yes, but also there's a lot of local implications. So whether it's an increase in surveillance, increase in the militarization of the local police, um, also going to the environmental justice issue, they'll likely need to pull lake water to do the cooling, because you need it to run a quantum computer. It takes a lot of energy, and so then you have to cool the room somehow, and so typically water, or helium, which is already a resource that's scarce, um, are going to be needed to cool this facility. And I was really drawn by this image that Spencer painted, or I guess he wrote, right, of like Iron Man being like, I'm not making these weapons, so like, why am I implicated? And the person responded, um, you're targeting the foundation. Like, the best way to maintain control is, quote, to target the foundations of freedom. And so when I think of, the quantum campus being developed, if a quantum computer is functional, encryption is essentially obsolete, at least in that facility, if you have access to that computer. And who has that access to that computer? The Department of Defense. And so it really enables like this rise in fascism, that we are seeing and will continue to see. And why youth organizing in particular is so important, is because I think we're already facing the negative impacts on the environment that militarization has had. But we, the youth, and then the youth, like, teenagers or toddlers, like, they're gonna see most of the brunt of the harmful impacts of the environment. And so it's central to our work at Dissenters to not only be like, military bad, which yes, military bad, US imperialism bad. I am the child of Guatemalan immigrants, and I always see myself as a direct result of US militarization and US intervention. But I think we're also going to continue to see, one, the impacts of the environment, and then frankly, like, our people are struggling to put food on the table, to have a roof above their heads. And that's why this divest invest framework is so important. And like, our work has not reached a point where we're able to build some of that invest side of things. We would love to eventually start building some of the alternatives to the systems that are currently in place to address the issues that our communities are facing. But at the very least, we can highlight, we spend so much on militarization in the name of, safety, in the name of, protecting ourselves from an impending war with China, um, to protect ourselves from, anything not Christian. Like, there's so many reasons as to why this is given, but our people just want to be able to survive, want to be able to go to the doctor, and not have to second guess if they're going to order call 911 because they can't afford to pay an ambulance. And so when we do this work, our youth always highlights like, yes, we're against this, but also highlighting why or what we could do with that money, right? We spend so much, yet our government says, oh, we can't provide that. They're threatening cutting like Social Security or whatever, but they're willing to, you know, off the cuff give like 250 million extra and weapons to Israel, right? Like there's the hyper local effects of that. And then of course at the end of the day, my personal belief is that US intervention, wherever it may come, is not driven by goodwill, is not driven by a sense of justice. It is driven typically by an aspiration for profit, either now or in the future. Um, whether it's oil, whether it's natural resources, whether it's land, whether it's minerals, you know, um, it's just always important to be skeptical, whether we're looking at the foreign policy itself or we're looking at the media we consume. It's important that we always question why someone may be doing something because unfortunately, like goodwill and U.S. government, U.S. foreign policy, at least to me, are um, essentially mutually exclusive. And so it feels important to end on that note of like be skeptical of everything you see and be skeptical of even foreign policy that claims to be bringing peace or some type of freedom to some group of people. Um, and instead always turn to those people themselves to hear what they need and support whatever struggles they are like currently fighting. But yeah, if there are, would love to continue doing this work myself and all the youth. And so just, of course, like stay in touch, keep us on your radar. We've been around 5 years and hoping we're going to be around much longer than that, and really start to shake the table.
Thanks, Josue. Um, I am just really feeling like all of the synapses firing because I feel like the youth in my heart is on fire, the academic mind is on fire, and the creative is just like fully in front of us. Just to kind of lay out a little bit of the rest of the time that we have. So we've got about 11 more minutes. Me and Olivia are gonna put out some questions that we had beforehand, and then we want to make sure to close with David sharing a little bit more about this consuming culture report. And then at the top of the hour, we're going to close down the recording and we're going to, for those that can stay that are panelists, there's no tie-in, but if you can stay to answer some of the audience questions, that's what we're going to kind of move into right at the top of the hour. And you can stay for as long as or as little as you can. And maybe we'll follow up with folks about any specific questions with the panelists. So, Olivia, maybe we can start off with your question, and then if we have enough time, I can ask a second question, and then we'll have David present the report.
Sure. And this is multi-pronged here, and based off of a combination with something that was put in the chat and then something we had earlier. But just in how would you define the military-industrial complex relationship to culture in the simplest terms? There's a questions of like how do we start conversations around this work of dismantling the military-industrial complex with younger generations. And also, then, what are the most effective ways the military uses its influence to shape the culture? And what are some more of the laughable or ineffective ones? So, those were a lot of things. Do you want to touch on part of those or all of that? And if we want to start with Spencer, and then we can go to the next couple folks.
Um,
Okay, great. So to take that really quick, I used to be Wired Magazine's Pentagon press corps reporter, and probably still the case. I don't really know over the last couple of years, but if you walk between the press bullpen in the Pentagon and the Pentagon briefing room, you get the Office of Hollywood Liaison. And one day I decided I was going to knock on the door and talk to the guy, a really nice guy named Phil Straub, who was essentially the Pentagon's man in Hollywood. And I asked him a whole bunch of questions about what his job was, what projects they were interested in, and so forth. But basically, what emerged from those conversations was that the military plays a very active role in funding Hollywood pictures. And along with that funding comes fairly strict criteria for how they can portray the U.S. military. Now, they can tell a story that's critical of the U.S. military, but up to a certain threshold. After which you've got to show off the hardware, like with Iron Man, and make it look like pretty cool. One of the things you can't do, and this was kind of a weird thing that I didn't expect, um, since we're talking about Marvel, the Pentagon initially sponsored the first Avengers movie in 2012, but then it pulled out from it, even though you can still see like F-35s in that. But it pulled out because there is an implication in the movie that there is a global supernatural security council that has command and control influence over the SHIELD organization. And at that point, the Pentagon decided that could risk too many questions publicly about the Pentagon willingly ceding U.S. sovereignty to this fictional entity. And the Pentagon accordingly pulled out of cooperating with the Marvel Studios Avengers movie. And that just seemed to me a microcosm of the ways in which the military sets parameters around how it will distribute money to be portrayed on film and manufacture the kind of consent that Josue mentioned.
Want to check to see if Josue or Miriam, if either of you have any thoughts on those questions.
Yeah, I can speak a bit more to the third question around how to start having these conversations with the younger generation. And my instinct, and it depends on what you mean younger. I think once you start talking to teenagers, I think the facts speak for themselves. I think our communities are struggling. And when you speak explicitly to what people are struggling through, you can oftentimes very quickly identify trends, typically around housing, around food justice. I think right now, like a lot of youth are struggling with everything going on with ICE raids and the threat of deportation feeling like it's always looming. And so I don't think we need to try too hard to find it in. I think we can speak to whatever they're struggling to and then begin to ask questions like, why do you think this is something we struggle with? Why do we think that, and who do you think should be addressing these issues? I think oftentimes people will identify like, isn't this the responsibility of a government or some government agency? And then I think the numbers speak for themselves that it's not that we don't have the ability to provide these things to our people, to our communities. It's that it's an active choice by somebody or by a group of people. And then depending on their age, you can get into why they may be choosing to do that. Whether it's they're looking to line their own pockets, whether they're vying for a board position, whether they I think there are some people that simply act off of prejudice, although I think they're the minority. Um, but I'd say let them guide the conversation, let them speak to what they're struggling with, and I think we can very easily identify like why the military industrial complex is it plays a key role in their lived experience.
Thanks, y'all. And
Thank
Miriam, I can't tell if you're coming off mute or anything, but if you want to chat us, if you have an answer, that'd be great. Oh,
How about now? Is that good?
that's great.
Am
Thanks.
I okay? I am not any kind of expert on popular culture, And I don't know. I know it's an astronomical amount of money that the Pentagon spends on, you know, getting popular culture to support the military-industrial complex. I bet David, if he's going to speak, I bet he knows that what that budget is. But I'd say, when you watch B-2 bombers flying in formation over the Super Bowl, and it strikes me as ridiculous. And every time, some comedy show will make fun of that, that seems like a very effective way to fight back. So that's my only thought.
I'm just going to pass it to David to kind of close us out with the report, and then we'll close down the recording before opening up the bigger questions.
Thanks so much, Mikkel. Thanks, Olivia, and thanks to all the fantastic speakers. This has been really inspiring, and really appreciate all the members of the audience who've been here. Just real quickly, I'll share a few slides because, as Miriam said, the militarization of pop culture is broad. Apologies. Because we want to leave you are focusing an article of Spencer's, hopefully on the screen.
Yeah, we are.
Link to fantastic. So so much of pop culture is militarized, often with the direct involvement of the Pentagon. And so when I heard that Spencer was writing the new Iron Man, I was thrilled that a critic of the military-industrial complex and the war on terror was involved in this major part of pop culture that has been so influential, and of course so many movies, and folks are seeing Top Gun now, hopefully. Yeah, fantastic. From Top Gun to the new Marvel movie to American Sniper, to video games that are profoundly militarized and feature representations of war. So to music, feature representations of war so frequently that glorify war and hide the deadly and destructive effects of war. And as a result, as part of this glorification, make it all the easier for the US military, for powerful people in the US government and their allies to wage war, including future wars. So we wanted to leave you with some ways to get involved in pushing back against the militarization of pop culture, that again, toys and social media, even in fashion, the prevalence of camo and in fashion is just one example. The Costs of War Project has launched a new project called the Consuming War Project that is going to expose the many ways in which pop culture is so profoundly militarized and show how that militarization, again, glorifies war and makes war possible and frequently more likely. The project has already started with a report on the militarization of Hollywood, of movies, of TV, streaming, and will come out with a series of reports exposing the many dimensions of the militarization of pop culture in the coming weeks and months, including in the ways you see before you. And people can get directly involved. In addition to reading and sharing the reports themselves, we are calling on people to share examples of militarized pop culture, to take a photo, take a screenshot of an example of militarized pop culture, and then share on social media with the hashtag consuming war. So everything from, a camo shirt to a video game to the little green the little green soldiers that, are so frequently a part of children's childhood socialization. Although note that this one actually is pushing back on that. It's actually a soldier in a yoga pose. So there are other examples of pushing back against and offering alternatives to militarized pop culture. I will also put the link to the Cost of War project, the Consuming War project in the chat, and would encourage everyone to get involved. Sorry, that was not the. Miguel and Olivia, why don't I let you close things out and then
yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for that. It's always nice to add to or to end with things that we can be part of right away. And thank you to all of our panelists. Like Miguel did say earlier, though, we are gonna like end the official part of this, but I know that there were some really great questions and that we could talk about this well beyond just 1 hour. Or some of us for our lifetimes committed to this work. So if folks are wanting to join or stay on after the hour, I'm not sure if our panelists are able to, but if one or all of you are able to, we can continue with some of those questions. But yeah, I don't know if you had anything else, Michael.
No, I think that's perfect. We'll kind of close down the recording, and for those that can stay, I think we can continue the conversation. But really appreciate everyone that was able to join for the full hour at the middle of the day on a Monday. Shout out to you. Just really deep appreciation to our panelists once again for coming with such brilliant thinking.